Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Ani Zadorian. I'm a partner at JLK Rosenberger, a leading CPA firm located in California and Texas. We are the 10th largest insurance practice in the United States. In addition to our firm's in-house insurance expertise, JLK Rosenberger is a member of PKF International Limited, the 15th largest global network of independent accounting firms. PKF provides our clients resources in over 150 countries with more than 440 offices in principal cities worldwide. PKF has unique depth and expertise in the insurance sector with representation in the world's key insurance domiciles. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. You are all muted, so please type your questions into the Q&A box. As we receive questions during the webinar, we will answer them at the end of each session. We will also have time for questions at the end. Also be prepared to answer polling questions throughout the webinar. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to our presenters. Martin Watson is a partner in the insurance practice of PKF Littlejohn and based in Leeds in the United Kingdom. Martin has worked with insurance companies as both an auditor and consultant for the last 15 years across a spectrum of privately held and FTSE 100 publicly traded entities in the UK. That work has exposed him to a variety of corporate reporting trends and topics. He has been actively following ESG reporting and engaging with his clients as they define and implement ESG reporting practices. Bill Rosenberger is a partner in the insurance practice of JLK Rosenberger, and he's based in Los Angeles. Bill has been working with property and casualty and life and health insurers since 1995. The bulk of Bill's experience is as an auditor. He also spends a significant portion of his time consulting around matters of regulatory compliance. And now I will turn the time over to Bill.
All right, thank you, Ani. So I'm going to start with just an overview of what we're going to cover in today's presentation. We're going to start with some of the key terms and definitions related to our topic. And then I'm going to go into why we think ESG is important right now, some of the standards and legislation that are emerging around ESG. Then I'm going to hand it over to Martin. He's going to cover some UK-related legislation, and then he's going to walk us through the TCFD framework. So I think from our perspective, mostly as American participants here, we want to take advantage of Martin's experience because Europe and the UK in particular have really taken the lead on ESG reporting. So Martin will be sharing some examples from Europe. I'll be adding in some examples from North America. And then we'll take a look at what the future of ESG might hold for us. And then, as Ani said, we'll get into some Q&A at the end. So starting with the key terms and definitions, right? The first one, of course, is ESG. So let's make sure we know what we're talking about. The E stands for environmental, the S stands for social, and the G stands for governance. So in the environmental category, what we're talking about is things that businesses might report related to climate, waste, pollution, how they use natural resources. The desire would be for an organization to identify threats and how they take advantage of opportunities that might be there. Then the social is an expression of certain company values relating to their interactions with different constituents. And those constituents might be employees, they might be clients, customers, vendors, even local communities, such as the city in which they're doing business. The last area is governance, and governance is really quite a broad area. It expresses how the entity governs itself, in particular with regard to these environmental and social objectives and how they might be integrated into the company's overall practices. So on the slide here, there's some suggestion that it might be how a company appoints directors, what it might do with regard to lobbying or making political contributions. So in practice, later on, we'll actually see how some entities have implemented this governance into their disclosures as well. So TCFD is a very important term for us today. So when we're talking about it in today's presentation, we're referring to a framework of recommended disclosures of climate-related financial information. And the acronym stands for Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures. So this was a group that was formed by the G20. It was specifically put together to make recommendations on climate-related disclosures for the purpose of promoting better informed investment, credit, and insurance underwriting decisions. So the other key terms here are Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. All of these refer to greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 1 would be a company's own greenhouse gas emissions from sources they control. Scope 2 would be purchased greenhouse gas emissions related to electrical, steam, or heating that they consume. And then Scope 3 is really the largest category of greenhouse gas emissions. It's sometimes called supply chain emissions. It's from any area in the company's value chain. So it might be entities that the company's doing business with, vendors. So it's a very large scope in which they need to collect information from other parties in order to determine the actual Scope 3 emissions. Okay, so with those definitions behind us, let's move on to why ESG is important. And so I would say that the real reason we think ESG is important in this moment is demand. On the right-hand side of this slide, we've identified some key stakeholders related to the organization, certainly investors, and the two graphs on the left we'll address in a minute. They relate to investor interest. The other key stakeholders might be regulators and Generation Z and millennials. And Generation Z and millennials are extremely interested in ESG and in social responsibility generally. We find these Gen Zers in our policyholder groups, in our vendors, and in our employees. So the graphs on the left are pointing out some of this investor interest in ESG information. So the graph on the top left is from a study that was performed by EY, by Ernst & Young, in which they gathered responses from participants that were indicating they wanted to see more information relating to ESG. And in particular, what they said was, we're not seeing enough information related to environmental risk, social risk, and governance risk. And what we can see is from the 2 times they did this survey from 2018 to 2020, that there were sharp increases, nearly doubling in all categories. The bottom graph is from S&P Global, and it's indicating the trend in green bonds, social bonds, sustainable bonds, everything that S&P Global calls sustainable debt issuances. And again, what you can see is that in 2018, there were about 200 billion in these sustainable debt issuances, whereas in 2021, at the time this graph was produced, the expectation was that it was going to be more than 1 trillion in these ESG sustainable debt type issuances. Now, I do want to caveat this because in 2022, we have seen a little bit of a retreat in this trend. And if we have time at the end, I can address where that trend looks like it is right now. All right, so the TCFD tells us that there are more than 120 regulators worldwide that are supporting the TCFD framework. So this is governments as well as their regulators. We're talking here on this slide about one particular regulator, right? The Securities and Exchange Commission in the U.S. has also voiced its support for the TCFD framework. So these dates are just kind of telling you where the Securities and Exchange Commission is coming from. So in March of 2021, the Securities and Exchange Commission created what was called the Climate ESG Task Force. And interestingly, they created this as a division of enforcement. So when the SEC did this, they were really signaling that they were interested in cracking down on false and misleading statements that were being made around ESG. Then in 2021, the SEC proposed rules that would require information and disclosures about climate-related risk. Climate-related risks that have a material impact on a business's financial results and operations. The required disclosures that they're proposing would follow the TCFD principles, and they would also include disclosures in annual reports, disclosures in financial statements themselves, and there would even be some attest related to these disclosures, which we'll talk about later on. So again, as I said, the ESG task force was originally formed as a division of enforcement. And in April of 2022, we saw the SEC take its first action when they filed a complaint against a Brazilian mining company alleging fraudulent ESG disclosures. And then even more recently in May, they reached a settlement with BNY Mellon Investment Advisors. So BNY Mellon agreed to pay $1.5 million in fines. They didn't indicate any wrongdoing. What we know from press releases is that the SEC was, again, alleging misleading statements regarding ESG relating to funds that were being managed by BNY Mellon. All right, and then going on a little bit further, the SEC also proposed some rules related to investment funds. So they proposed two rules. The first deals with funds that use ESG in their name. And basically what the SEC is saying is that, hey, if you're using ESG in your name, you have to, in fact, be investing in investments. At least 80% of those investments must be ESG investments. Now, I know there's still some nebulous definitions around what that is, but they're saying that these funds can't just use ESG as a criteria for evaluating investments. They do, in fact, have to be ESG investments. The second rule required disclosure about how these funds are achieving ESG objectives. And then in addition, they want these funds to disclose the emissions of companies that are in their portfolio. So it's quite expansive. All right, so that's the Securities and Exchange Commission. And now hitting a little closer to home for all insurance companies is the NAIC. So this shows the NAIC's path towards the TCFD framework. Back in 2010, the NAIC established a climate and resiliency task force. They adapted a climate risk disclosure survey at that time. So it was 8 questions, and it was a voluntary survey that was administered to companies that wrote 500 million or more in premium, and it was administered in 12 states that, again, voluntarily participated. A year later, it was reduced to a 300 million threshold. Later on, it would actually get reduced to 100 million threshold. And what's occurred is that the NAIC has gradually moved towards this idea of scrapping the 8-question survey and replacing it with a TCFD styled report. So in April of 2022, the NAIC made that decision. The revised TCFD styled reports, which were originally going to be due August 31st, have been extended, and they're going to be due November 30th. Again, this is a voluntary survey, so not all states are participating in it. About 15 states, maybe 16 states participate. Also, the District of Columbia participates. And I do want to mention that this survey, while it's an NAIC survey, it's being administered by the California Department of Insurance, who has decided to take the lead in some of these ESG reporting issues. And they make all of these ESG reports available to the public. So they're on their website, and I'll discuss a little bit of that about that later on as well. All right, so moving on to AM Best. So while not really standards or a legislator, AM Best, and I don't have a lot of time to go into all that AM Best has done here, but AM Best has indicated, and they are asking for ESG related disclosures. They are being included in their best credit rating methodology. The methodology, they always said, was based on 4 building blocks: the balance sheet strength, the operating performance, the business profile, and enterprise risk management. They're saying ESG crosses over all those lines. They are actually including it in their reports, though, as an element of the enterprise risk management. And there is a frequently asked questions that AM Best has published on this that gives you some more information on where they are. ESG also in that FAQ indicates some factors that they observe as impacting rating actions, and those are on the right-hand side. The obvious ones are issues related to catastrophe or weather-related events, but you'll see the third bullet point, they're looking at things including reputational risk from environmental, social, and governance factors as well. So anyway, what I think we're seeing is that it's quite pervasive, and that a lot of the regulators and rating agencies are taking great interest in ESG. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Martin.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a fantastic segue into say what regulators are interested in, because I'm just going to talk firstly about what we're seeing the regulators here in the UK having done recently on the subject of climate change reporting in particular. So Her Majesty's Treasury is the government's economic and finance ministry here in the UK. What I'm showing here is a brief diagram from their roadmap that they released, being a roadmap towards mandatory climate related disclosures here in the UK. This was actually released in 2020 and basically sets out, say, that indicative path towards these mandatory disclosures, but aligned with the TCFD framework, which Bill has already explained. And like all good political bodies, what was the government doing here? They, to be honest, weren't reinventing the wheel. They were very much consolidating lots of work which had already been done by numerous regulatory bodies that we have here in the UK, and I'll talk through some of them now. On this side of the pond, as I say, we have numerous regulators, and the key bodies that we have up here are those who regulate publicly listed companies, so those with equities traded on exchanges, and that's the FCA, our Financial Conduct Authority. But we also have the PRA, the Prudential Regulatory Authority, which looks after banks, insurance companies, and also then a separate pensions regulator. And these bodies have actually been issuing guidance on the subject of climate change reporting from 2019. And we started to see that reporting come into effect from 2021. And in many cases, there are some firms that already early adopted a lot of this guidance. This is then all in addition to some of the basic reporting, which was written into our Companies Act and something which governs all reporting for all UK incorporated companies, where people have had to disclose, well, I should say companies of a certain size have had to disclose the scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions for a couple of years now, which again, something Bill outlined earlier. People often ask, why is so much effort being put into this? The belief, say, certainly in the UK government and many governments in Europe, is that high quality disclosures about how organisations and assets are going to be impacted by, and also then impact environmental change, is going to improve transparency, encouraging better informed pricing decisions and capital allocation as well. And this in turn, it is hoped, should drive more investment into more sustainable projects and activities in the future. At this place, I will just call on Annie just to check whether or not we've had any questions from anyone who we could answer now.
Yeah, so we don't have any questions at this time. So we're going to launch our first polling question. On March 4, 2021, the Securities and Exchange Commission created which body? ESG focus group, climate change enforcement team, climate and ESG task force within the division of enforcement, or the ESG Avengers. Okay, you've got 10 more seconds, and then we'll go to the next slide. All right, here are the results. Martin, you want to cover the answer?
Thank you, Annie. So happy to see most people have been paying attention and got that right. Apologies, just get back a slide. So this the correct answer is the Climate and ESG Task Force within the Division of Enforcement of the SEC. So this is far more than just a focus group that was set up. The SEC clearly taking this very, very seriously. For that reason as well, the climate change enforcement team is not the correct answer. The point here to stress is that this task force has been set up within the Division of Enforcement, and hopefully people picked up the ESG Avengers. It's just my love of Marvel films. So well done to those who got that right. Moving on then to the next segment of our presentation, which is starting to take us through a bit more detail around the ESG framework and what that entails. But first of all, having been through this here in the UK, I just thought I'd start with the subject of how do you actually get started here. I'll first of all start by saying at the outset, and perhaps address somewhat of an elephant in the room, that many people are still skeptical about the subject of ESG reporting. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that everyone in Europe is completely on board with this either and thinks it's a great idea, but there are an enormous number of voices backed as well by a great deal of political will who are demanding action and change from all organisations on this front. For some people, ESG reporting may just be a compliance exercise, but for others, it will be, in some cases already is, an integral part of their strategy and a way of differentiating themselves in what is a very crowded marketplace. So where do you begin? It's fair to say that there's so much commentary out there regarding ESG reporting and climate change in particular that it can be difficult to know exactly where to start. From our experience of working with insurers here in Europe and in the UK in particular, who've already been on this journey, we've got several things here on the slide which we think are fundamental. So firstly, you shouldn't be seeking to reinvent the wheel. The good news is that you don't need to start from scratch. We've mentioned already the TCFD framework several times, which is a well-established and widely used framework for approaching climate change reporting. And as I say, we're going to delve into the constituent parts of it in the next few minutes. You also don't need to write your own playbook when it comes to reporting and measuring how you're performing. There's already a host of well-established metrics ranging from free carbon consumption tools to asset managers who will provide you reports as to how green your investment portfolio is. Secondly, board buy-in. As with any key strategic initiative, those at the top of the organisation have to be behind it. In the UK, the regulator of banks and insurers has actually gone so far as to say you have to have a board member who's formally responsible for climate change. And with that comes certain regulatory responsibilities, just as there's someone who's the chief actuary or chief accountant who similarly has regulatory responsibilities and personal sanctions if they don't comply with them. The board basically needs to be clearly accountable for this subject and put in place systems and processes to make sure that climate change is being considered in all the right areas of an organisation. And thirdly, on here, risk assessment. again, from our experience in Europe, I'm here to tell you that all of this regulation hasn't necessarily meant a change for everybody. Our guidance and legislation doesn't say that you blanket need to comply with rules X, Y, and Z. For banks and insurers, it's telling them that their response needs to be proportionate to the level of risk that climate change represents. And so we have guidance on what the different types of risk are. So you've got physical risks from extreme weather events, for example, which may mean your underwriting techniques need to be revised. But you also have transition risks. So for example, if you're an insurance company and you hold all of your investments in long dated debt, which was issued by a coal miner, you may be concerned as to the value of those investments as the world moves away from coal. But for some, the sorts of risks we've talked about there could have a massive financial impact, and your stakeholders really should be told as to what that risk is. But for others, this risk is going to be less severe, and your external reporting may be much simpler and simply say that fact. So moving on then to the TCFD framework. So a few points on here just to pull out. We talk about the Financial Stability Board, or the FSB. They are a body who their basic aim is to promote international financial stability, and it does this by coordinating numerous national financial authorities and international standard setting bodies to basically try and work towards developing strong regulatory, supervisory, or other financial sector policies. The TCFD framework is the output of some of their work. The TCFD framework is structured around these 4 thematic areas: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. And that's what we'll step through in a second. And it's also worth saying that the TCFD framework is underpinned by 7 key principles, basically saying that the disclosures which you put out there should be, or they should represent relevant information, they should be specific and complete, they should be clear, balanced and understandable, they should also be clear over time, they should be comparable between various different companies within a sector, they should be reliable and also verifiable if there was any sort of third-party attestation ever needed, and they should be provided on a timely basis. What does the TCFD believe the benefits of this better disclosure to be? They believe that it's going to lead to more effective risk assessment in terms of climate-related risks to you, your company, but also the supply chain, which supports you. Also believe that it will enable you to make better informed decisions with regards to how you allocate your capital. And thirdly, they also talk about strategic planning and how these disclosures will better enable you to evaluate what the risks and exposures are to those risks of climate change. So moving in then to the first area of TCFD, which is all around governance. And basically how I'm going to try and structure this presentation is give you a bit of an overview of what we see some of the larger European insurance organisations doing in this area, and then maybe talk about what we in the UK are seeing some of our perhaps small or medium-sized insurance companies, that's the likes of those who I understand are going to be on this call, how are they adopting to these new rules and standards. So under governance, first of all, the TCFD recommended disclosures under this heading are to describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities, and also then to describe management's role in assessing and managing said risks and opportunities. So how have we seen firms responding so far? I would say in their external reporting, firms have been disclosing very clear statements around board ownership, their oversight, or what their sort of commitment is from the top of the house, and making it basically very clear that this is being taken seriously as local regulators have insisted upon. Even more recently, and recent developments in some of these larger organizations, you've seen executive structures actually start to change to have dedicated sustainability committees, which will be subcommittees of the board, and even people given executive C-suite level roles which are completely focused on sustainability. For example, the Chief Sustainability and People Officer is a term not seen 12 months ago, but now there are several of those in large organizations around the UK market. Secondly, in line with a general trend around corporate reporting in the UK, boards have been describing not just the fact that they have oversight, but giving examples of how they exercise that oversight, how they're accountable, giving some case studies. Some have even gone so far as to include structure charts to show how the various governance bodies interact and talk about how climate change considerations might flow up through that structure. This has then been extended by some even further down, who've actually started talking about how management's reporting lines work with regard to climate risks and opportunities. And lastly, we've also seen some people linking climate change and broader sustainability factors into directors' remuneration, as well as explain how they are embedding climate change as a consideration then at all levels of the organisation and appraising performance. One example would be one of our large FTSE 100 listed insurers is a group called Aviva, one of the leaders on climate change and that agenda in Europe. And they publicly said that 10% of their directors' bonuses, flexed up to 20%, is going to be based on sustainability metrics for their directors going forward. In terms then of sort of medium and smaller end of the market, what are we seeing people doing there? How are they responding? So it's clear that smaller organizations are not going to have the same complex governance structures which these larger organizations do. But nevertheless, we've got some examples here from, say, some of our smaller insurers. Firms are still articulating or needing to articulate exactly how their current governance structure takes account of climate change and who has that responsibility. What's important is that you need to be able to explain and demonstrate how that governance over climate change is being achieved. And that's, say, not necessarily something for your external reporting, but as and when you have external regulatory conversations, you need to be able to, say, demonstrate and have some evidence as to exactly how you've considered that. So what are people doing? They're certainly repurposing a lot of the existing government-related information that they already have, and within that trying to weave in the additional considerations around climate change, again, which given the size of these organizations and their resources makes complete sense. Last point I'd draw out on here is the point around linking it into your broader purpose and vision and values. Again, I'd say organizations of all sizes are doing this to sort of varying degrees of sophistication, but the best people or the most advanced people say are able to very clearly articulate, okay, we're giving a lot of climate change related information, but how does that link into who we are as an organization? And that helps to keep the information meaningful and believable when you're talking about you taking it seriously at a governance level. Again, I'll hand back to Annie at this stage to check whether or not we've had any questions.
Yes, we have a couple of questions. I think probably the first one, Bill, you could take it, and then likely the next one too. So here's the first one. Is there a reporting threshold in California for the TCFD reporting in November 2022?
Yes. Right now, the threshold remains at 100 million in premium. So it's the same threshold that was established under the previous 8-question survey.
Okay. Next question is,
I should specify that's gross premium, right? So direct and assumed together would be the 100 million threshold.
okay. Next question: how much of a focus are ESG investments in the AM Best rating model? Any requirements from the NAIC DOI to adopt some of ESG focused investments policy?
So with regard to investment threshold, I don't know enough about the AM Best rating, credit rating mechanism yet, but anecdotally from conversations with other insurers at this point, my understanding is that AM Best is requesting information around ESG, and it's really for purposes of including it in these credit reports. And some of these insurers will also push back because, as Martin said, not everybody is in agreement with some of the ESG required reporting. So I don't believe that there are specific requirements yet. I think there's more to come from the AM Best and other rating agencies in that regard.
Okay.
Does that answer the question, you think, Connie?
I think so, yeah. All right, with that, we're going to launch our next polling question. Okay, here we go. So the Financial Stability Board created the task force on climate-related financial disclosures to improve and increase reporting climate-related financial information. What did they not cite as one of the benefits of better disclosure? Workforce well-being, risk assessment, capital allocation, or strategic planning? We'll give you about 20 seconds to answer. Okay. All right, we can go to the, Martin, you want to go to the next slide? We can, while people are answering, we can, yeah.
Thank you, Annie. So again, great to see most people getting that question right. Thank you. And a difficult one, I guess, because arguably all of these points here could be seen as benefits of better disclosure. But in terms of what the TCFD said, it was risk assessment, capital allocation, and strategic planning, which it saw as being the key benefits of better disclosure in this area. So moving on then to the next element of the TCFD framework, which is all around risk management. So I won't go through points 1 to 4 on here. People can read them for themselves, but this is, as a clue is in the title, all about disclosing your processes for identifying client-related risks, and indeed then what you view those risks as being. So what have we seen here in the UK and Europe? I think people have generally been able to grasp quite easily what they view the risks as being, and in particular the financial risks arising from climate change. And then we already have quite granular and detailed reporting required here in the UK and Europe around what an organisation deems its principal risks and uncertainties to be. So integrating that climate change risk into here has not been too difficult. Apologies, it's a bit small with the diagram here on the right hand side, but how it's interesting how things have started to develop, because say currently a lot of the regulatory and mandatory disclosures are all centered on climate change, but clearly with a view to bringing in more regulations around broader ESG disclosures in the future. But some people have already started to go there, and this diagram here is something which Bupa, so that's a large multinational health insurer we have here, which is headquartered in the UK. And 12 months ago, they were solely focused on climate change, but you now look on their website, and this is a little risk map showing all of the ESG factors to which they think they're exposed, and they're mapping them out there on a matrix to describe the impact. So it's an area which continues to evolve, and an area where people continue to get more sophisticated. So in terms of the granularity then of that reporting, as well as say people talking about the risks that they're exposed to, I'd say the granularity of those risks is also, it varies. There's varying level of detail out there in terms of, clearly I think driven by how much time people have had to devote to this topic and how sophisticated their internal models are. But there's also a big part here about proportionality. I said at the outset, for some climate related risks are going to be potentially have a large financial impact on the book they've written. Say if they're a property and casualty insurer underwriting a lot of property related risks which are near floodplains, versus life insurers who perhaps might not see any impacts on their mortality rates for many years to come. As well as though talking about those climate related risks, you are encouraged to also talk about what climate related opportunities may be out there. Thus far, most people have not gone there, perhaps being a bit, say, pessimistic and just focusing on what they're worried about and what the risks to organisations may be. But again, that is something more and more people are starting to come around to and talk more about in terms of what some of the opportunities of climate change may be for their business. So this was then talking about what we're seeing for the larger organisations, moving on to some of the more smaller and medium-sized insurers we work with as well. It's fair to say that, I guess, linking in what we said previously about the larger organisations, given that risk reporting is already there, it's been quite easy, I would dare say, for all of our insurers to talk about climate change risk in the context of existing risk management framework. What's probably then been more difficult is that level of detail underneath, in terms of actually trying to make sure it's comprehensively built in to your your risk universes, your risk documentation and processes which support that risk assessment process to make sure that it is being as thoroughly thought about as all the other many risks you've identified have been monitoring and reporting on probably for several years. Probably one more point to pull out on here is that for small organizations, you may have some reliance on third parties for a lot of this information. So the key example here, say, would be your investment manager who is monitoring your investment portfolio. You may indeed outsource certain elements of that to them and asking them to make sure you are complying with your green aspirations with regards to investing. And so we've seen some companies have difficulties getting the information they want from those external parties in a timely manner. Is something which needs to be thought about. Moving on then to the third area, which is all about strategy. So there is a bit of overlap here with risk management. So I will again not cover ground which has already been talked about. As I have said already, TCFD wants entities to describe both the risks and opportunities identified, but then how they are impacting your business and your strategy. They want people to basically describe how resilient their organization is to various different climate-related scenarios, which you think could reasonably impact upon your business. Maybe just, we have had a lot of regulatory feedback already here in the UK and Europe on the disclosure which is already out there. And this is an area where regulators have been quite vocal and basically been saying there is a lot of work still to do. The largest insurers out there have, had the resources to think about the impact of climate change on their strategy, but then also think about the impact of their strategy on the outside world and on the climate. And so they've thought holistically about climate change and its impact on their product offering, their investment decisions, operations and pricing, etc. But it's fair to say that this is an area, I've already touched upon this previously, where most organizations, I would say, still have a lot of work to do and are going to need some more time to get there. I would stress, though, on this point that none of the regulators, indeed no one in the UK, is really sending out a message of panic or saying urgent action is needed by companies. Whilst climate change is absolutely an urgent matter, stakeholders are generally quite understanding that these disclosures are going to take some time to get right. And there's a quote here from an investor that one of our regulators spoke to, which is basically saying that they recognise at the moment this is perhaps more art than science. And they just want some comfort that the company is doing the right things, is thinking about the topic of climate change, identifying what the key risks are, and being transparent and open in terms of where they're up to on that journey. Bringing it back perhaps to, again, so the smaller and medium-sized end of the market, what I've said previously regarding sort of board level discussions, which I've been privy to recently, there are many smaller and medium-sized insurers who perhaps not had the bandwidth, things such as pandemics going on and lots of other things taking up their time to basically sit down and say develop these detailed strategies. But what we think is really important, we're advising clients on here in the UK, is to make sure you're balancing that desire to just maintain compliance and meet these regulations which the regulators are sending your way, but balancing that with disclosures which are actually meaningful and will actually help you as a business measure change within your organization when it comes to climate change and other ESG related factors. I believe, Annie, it's now time for another polling question, unless we have any questions from the audience.
No questions from the audience, so we're going to launch our third polling question. Per the TCFD framework, which of the following is not a recommended disclosure in relation to the impact of climate change on an organization's strategy? Describe the climate-related risks and opportunities the organization has identified. Describe the operational changes an organization intends to implement to respond to the risks and opportunities identified. Describe the impact of climate-related risk and opportunities on the organization's business and strategy, or describe the resilience of the organization's strategy, taking into account different climate risk scenarios. Give you a few seconds to answer. Okay, Martin, if you want to move on. Yes.
Actually, before you move on, I noticed here in my notes that one of the previous questions also asked about I guess, DOIs, departments of insurance, requiring certain ESG investments. And I did want to clarify, it sounded like specifically a California related question, that we haven't seen California require the ESG labeled investments, but that regulators do sometimes use their code in a different way to encourage different types of investments. And California in particular has a COIN, California Organized Investment Network, which is for underserved and rural communities. And what California has done to encourage investment in that regard is they've actually relaxed the code limitations on certain investments. So where otherwise you might exceed it and end up with a non-admitted asset, California has waived the code with regard to certain investments in order to encourage companies to go out and invest in a particular area. So I would be on the lookout for regulators using that mechanism.
Right. Thanks, Bill.
So thank you for those answers. Appreciate this was probably the most difficult question so far, but the correct answer in terms of which is not a recommended disclosure in relation to the impact of climate change, it's B. The reason for that is that absolutely regulators or the TCFD wants you to describe both risks and opportunities in relation to your organization. D, I specifically mentioned, it's the resilience then of your organization and its strategy to those climate related scenarios. C is one of the things which TCFD talks about, and that's explicitly talking about your business and your strategy. Arguably then B, in terms of operationally, how is your business going to change because of climate change? You could see that as being part of your impact on your business and your strategy, but operational changes is not something which specifically is called out by TCFD. So B was the correct answer there. So lastly from me, those keeping tabs, will know I've got one more area of the TCFD framework to go through, and that's around metrics and targets. So what are we seeing in this space? So what does TCFD want here? It wants to see what your organization is shooting for with regards to climate change, so your targets, and also how you're measuring your progress towards them through some metrics. Looking at the existing public reporting we see across the insurance industry here in Europe, to be honest, very few people are actually at a place where they can say they're doing this. Some people are disclosing high-level ambitions or commitments as to what they're going to focus on, but it's only the very largest insurers out there who have comprehensive sets of targets and metrics which enable you to begin to get a bit of a sense as to how they are performing with regards to climate change and measuring their progress towards these aspirations that they have. I would say this is something which, looking at the 2021 reports we're starting to see come out now, steps are being made, but it is still very much at that top end of the market in terms of the largest organizations. It's probably fair to say that the smaller organizations still do have some work to do. The second slide here is then summarizing what we're seeing in that smaller end of the market. And the message I just want to bring out here is that what I've just said there around not everyone is perhaps complying in this area just yet, or has comprehensive metrics and targets. That may sound somewhat damning, but to be honest, it's not a terrible position to be in. And it's something which regulators in the UK have indeed already foreseen. Yes, they put this regulation out there, but the thematic feedback we're getting is that they recognise its importance for proportionality, particularly when it comes to the smaller and medium-sized insurers that are out there. And they also recognise that some organisations may want to just start with qualitative metrics and targets and ultimately build towards more quantitative metrics and targets that they can set with confidence once perhaps the industry is a bit more advanced in this area. So there is lots more convergence yet to happen, I think, when it comes to climate change more broadly, but certainly around metrics and targets. And one of the last thing for me I wanted to mention is that in terms of things still to happen or things which are very recently happening, we do have a new body which has been set up, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board. It's part or a sister organization to the body which sets international accounting standards. And they are working closely with, or they've indeed consolidated many regulators around the globe and are working with other regulators as well, to basically start to bring out comprehensive sets of rules and guidance to try and drive some more consistency in this area and drive this element of the reporting forward. On that note, I will pass back to Bill, who's just going to then start to look or start with an example of how we're seeing this being applied in the US.
Thanks, Martin. I'm gonna try and so here again, as I was looking for examples, I was keeping in mind those 4 building blocks, right? The governance, the strategy, risk management, and then the metrics and targets. And as I was combing through, particularly the TCFD style reports that are already out there, I picked 2. One of them is from Fairfax Financial Holdings, a North American company, right? Canadian parent with international subsidiaries. And again, you can see that they've addressed some of these areas just by a look at their table of contents. This was a fairly lengthy report, about 50 pages, not as long as some, but much longer than a lot of the other reports that are out there. So they put a lot of effort into putting this together. What I do gather from the Fairfax Financial Holdings report is similar to what you've indicated, is that this is an organization that is in early stages. So while they voice some strategy, and they certainly voice what they're doing in a governance perspective, there aren't clear metrics and targets in this report. So I do like the infographics that they include in the report, one, because it's great for presentation purpose, right? Rather than the 50 pages, you can get a picture of what they're trying to achieve. And I think what some of the things that stand out are the social issues in their report. And in fact, most of their report is dedicated to social type issues. And so you can see in the middle of this infographic on the left that they've indicated that 54% of their workplace is women, and that the women having achieved an executive level position are 23%. So it's an interesting graphic, also voices something about what their goals are, at least with regard to workplace diversity. On the right-hand side of the slide, I think we can get some idea of what their strategy is in addition to processes that they have in place. So on the top, there is some information about activities that they're doing in order to reduce carbon footprint with regard to recycling, waste reduction, even down to training of their employees. And then in the bottom right, I think it's a little bit more interesting is a little bit about how they are looking at environmental standards and including them in their underwriting and operating guidelines. And again, using the employee training, at least of their underwriting staff, I would presume, as an element of this program. Again, this is early stages, but I think if you are looking at reports, this is really a good example of a good effort. So this next example is from AIG, and this is my favorite report that I see out there. AIG has been working on these reports for several years, so this is their 3rd or 4th edition of this report. And you can tell that they've put a lot of effort into this. You can see in the middle under the environmental section that they've even indicated that their commitment to net zero. So unlike the Fairfax Holdings report, if we get in here, you are going to find some metrics and targets, and I'll share those with you. But what I think is very interesting about this report, if you are looking to do some TCFD reporting for the first time for your organization, is that this report, as you see in the bottom right-hand corner under About This Report, it has each of the most significant frameworks that are out there. including the TCFD framework. And if you go to those appendices, they've actually cross-referenced the framework to how they've addressed the standards. And it's very clear linkage in the report. So it's a great roadmap if you're looking for one. Again, they have a fantastic infographic in there that shows some of what they're thinking about in their ESG framework. At the top left, again, we see this commitment to net zero. In the middle, we see that they've given 25 million to charity. On the left-hand side, we also see the second graphic there indicates 160 million invested in wind farms. So we're getting kind of a broad perspective of what AIG has identified as important issues. But I want to get to this slide because I know we're running short on time, but this is where AIG has actually disclosed the metrics and related to this net zero target. In particular, they've identified the metrics around scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Now, I do want to point out that on the right-hand side, if you were to see that 2021 column, that's the scope 3 emissions. And it says that there are 517,000 tons of scope 3 emissions. If we compare that to 2021 scope 1 and scope 2, scope 1 is 73,000 tons and scope 2 is 17,000 tons of emissions. Now, I don't know exactly how they identified all of these. We can glean from the report that from 2020 to 2021, they gathered a great deal of information regarding these emissions, and it did follow a several-year consulting arrangement where they brought organizations in to help them identify these different scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Again, I want to point out that those scope 3 emissions are so large relative to all of the emissions that are being accounted for here. And if you remember, the SEC disclosures are going to require similar scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And what's significant to me about those scope 3 emissions is that the organizations have to go out to their third parties. So there is a trickle-down effect of this legislation if it were to go through, I should say rules, if they are to go through. All right. With that, I just want to take a quick look at the future. So again, the SEC's rules went through a comment period. That comment period has closed. We're now waiting to see what the SEC is going to do with regard to decisions on these rules. Let me tell you that there has been quite a bit of pushback. We know that one of the comment letters came from 24 AGs of states saying that they're going to sue the SEC if the SEC goes ahead with these regulations. So I'd say that there is some uncertainty of the outcome, but all of this timeline is based on the SEC proceeding with the rules as planned January 1, 2023. And I'm just going to briefly tell you that the SEC has prescribed these rules based on the size of the entity. And the largest entity from an SEC perspective is what's called a large accelerated filer. The next level would be an accelerated filer. After that, we have a non-accelerated filer, and then a smaller reporting company. And the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions are required for both the accelerated and large accelerated filers and the non-accelerated filers. However, small reporting companies get a pass, so they won't have to gather all that information that goes into scope 3. So small reporting entities are fortunate in that if these rules proceed, that at least they don't have to comply with the scope 3 requirements. The other effect on smaller and medium-sized entities here is that both smaller reporting companies and non-accelerated filers are exempt from attestation on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So the attestation is going to be quite a big deal if these proceed. The large accelerated filers and the accelerated filers are going to have to find, whether it's their auditors or another organization, it's not clear, but some attestation as to the accuracy of those scope 1 and scope 2 disclosures. Okay, Ani, can we maybe go to this polling question now?
Yeah, let's go to our final polling question. So under the proposed SEC rules to enhance and standardize climate-related disclosures, the following type of registrants are exempt from scope 3 emission disclosures. All types of filers, smaller reporting companies, accelerated filers, non-accelerated filers, and smaller reporting companies, or non-accelerated filers and smaller reporting companies. Okay, give it a few seconds here. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We're getting to the conclusion of our presentation and we'll address them. Okay.
I'm going to move to the answer slide here. So it's good to see that most got the right answer. So yes, the smaller reporting company is going to be exempt from the disclosure requirements. The accelerated filers and non-accelerated filers as well are again all required to do the scope 3 emissions. So there are 2 exclusions. Small reporting companies don't need to do the scope 3 emissions, and then non-accelerated filers and smaller reporting companies don't need to do the attestation. So with that, do we have any parting thoughts, Martin?
I don't think so. Thank you, Bill. I'll just say that hopefully this presentation has been useful, and what I've been saying about what we've been seeing here in the UK and Europe, it's not been what's about right or wrong with regards to climate change reporting and TCFD disclosures, but hopefully it's given you some food for thought as and when you need to start producing such disclosures for yourselves over on your side of the pond.
Ani, so do we have any final questions, Ani? Because I know we're here at the end of our time allotted.
Yeah, no more questions. So I will just conclude this webinar. So thanks, Bill and Martin. So developing a meaningful approach to ESG reporting will take time for most insurance companies. It will look different in every company based on investment mix and the need for the stakeholders. If you have questions about how to start the ESG reporting process in our organization, JLK Rosenberger stands to help. Reach out to JLK Rosenberger team members. Our contact information is here on the screen. So if you want to move on to the next screen, Bill, you can share that information. And finally, you will receive an email tomorrow with a link to a recording of this webinar and resources. And I want to thank you again for your time and joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.